Picture this. You are standing in a covered market in the city of Samarkand, somewhere in the early 600s CE. The air smells like a combination of things that have no business being in the same room together. Cinnamon and horse sweat, expensive perfume and camel hair, roasting meat, and the sharp mineral scent of freshly dyed silk. It is very loud and very hot, and there is absolutely nowhere to stand that isn't in someone's way. Around you, people are talking in at least 6 languages simultaneously, which should be complete chaos, and yet somehow it isn't. Somehow it all works. Deals are being made. Goods are changing hands. A man in a long robe, the color of deep red wine, is explaining something to a Chinese merchant using a mix of 3 different languages and what appears to be a very expressive system of hand gestures, and both of them are nodding and looking satisfied. The man in the red robe is a Sogdian, and he is in his absolute element. The Sogdians are one of history's most fascinating forgotten civilizations, and tonight, we're going to spend a long, slow evening getting to know them properly. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. And tell me where you are right now. Drop your location and local time in the comments. It doesn't matter if it's midnight in Melbourne or 4 in the afternoon in Morocco. I want to know where in the world people are settling in for this journey. Every single comment gets read and every location matters. Now, dim the lights and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Sogdians were an Eastern Iranian people, meaning they spoke a language closely related to Persian, in the same family but distinct enough to be its own tongue, whose homeland was a region called Sogdiana. Sogdiana occupied what is today the heart of Central Asia. The fertile river valleys of modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan centered around 2 cities that would become among the most important in the ancient world. The first was Samarkand, which the Sogdians called Marakanda, a city that sat in the Zarafshan River Valley and would eventually become famous enough to be written about by travelers from Greece to China. The second was Bukhara, an oasis city slightly to the west that functioned as Sogdiana's other great commercial center. Between these 2 cities, and extending out in all directions across a landscape of irrigated agricultural land, smaller towns, and mountain passes connecting to the wider world, the Sogdians built something that the modern world has largely forgotten they built. The most sophisticated and far-reaching long-distance trading network in ancient and early medieval history. For roughly 400 years, from approximately the 4th century through the 8th century CE, the Sogdians dominated the Silk Road, not participated in it. Not contributed to it, dominated it. They were the Silk Road, in a very real sense, the human infrastructure that made the whole thing function. Their language became the common language of trade across Central Asia, the way English is the common language of global business today. Their silver coins, stamped with the faces of their own local rulers, were accepted in markets from Constantinople to the capital of Tang Dynasty China, a distance of over 4,000 miles. Their trading posts dotted the known world like a medieval version of corporate branch offices, staffed by family members and business partners who maintained a network of trust and credit across distances that would have made most people of the era's eyes go wide. Historians still argue about exactly when the Sogdian commercial network reached its peak, and whether it should be measured in terms of geographic range, commercial volume, or cultural influence. All 3 of those things were extraordinary, and they did not all peak at exactly the same time. But the broad consensus places the golden age of Sogdian trade and cultural output between roughly 500 and 800 CE, a period that happened to coincide with the height of the Tang Dynasty in China and the early expansion of the Islamic Caliphate from Arabia westward. The Sogdians were, in the language of one modern historian who studied them closely, cultural bees. They moved constantly between the great civilizations of the ancient world: Persian, Indian, Chinese, Byzantine, nomadic Turkic, collecting ideas and practices and stories and technologies from each one, carrying them back to their home cities, and then carrying them outward again to the other civilizations along their routes. They did not merely transport goods. They transported knowledge, religion, art, music, dance, stories, and the written word itself. In the process, they shaped the cultural landscape of Eurasia in ways that historians are still working to fully understand. And then they disappeared. Not in a dramatic single moment, but gradually, across the 8th and 9th centuries, as the Islamic conquest of their homeland transformed the region and their distinctive language and identity dissolved into the Persian and Turkic cultures that surrounded them. By the time the medieval Islamic geographers were writing their great surveys of the known world, the Sogdians were already fading from memory. By the time European scholars began studying Central Asian history in the 19th century, the Sogdians were almost entirely forgotten. It took the discovery of a handful of letters, buried in a desert watchtower in western China for 16 centuries, to begin bringing them back. The square in Samarkand where that imaginary market stands is not the only entry point into the Sogdian world, but it is a useful one because it captures something essential about what made the Sogdians different from every other people they dealt with. Other civilizations of the ancient world were great in the ways that ancient civilizations were typically great: large armies, enormous monuments, complicated religious systems, magnificent courts. The Sogdians were great in a different way. They were great because they knew how to make things work across distances and differences, because they had the patience and the skill to operate in the gaps between civilizations without belonging fully to any of them. The covered markets of Samarkand, the bazaars, as they would eventually be called in the Persian that would replace Sogdian as the city's language, were organized with the careful logic of people who had been thinking about commercial infrastructure for a long time. Different categories of goods had their own sections of the market, their own streets and squares, so that a buyer looking for silk went to one area, and a buyer looking for metalwork went to another, and the whole system was organized in a way that minimized confusion and maximized the efficiency of transactions. Medieval Islamic geographers who visited and described Samarkand centuries after the Sogdian period ended still marveled at the organization of its markets, which suggests that the underlying logic established in the Sogdian period had proven durable enough to survive the political changes that followed. The smell of cinnamon in that imagined market was not accidental. Cinnamon was one of the valuable spices that moved through Sogdian hands from India westward, a commodity that was worth considerable money in the Mediterranean world where it did not grow. The smell of horse was equally not accidental. The great horse market of Samarkand was famous across the region. The Chinese emperors needed the tall, fast horses of Central Asia for their cavalry. The native Chinese horses were smaller and less suitable for the heavy cavalry that was becoming the dominant military technology of the period, and they were willing to pay silk for them, bolt after bolt of the most valuable textile in the ancient world. The Sogdians managed this exchange, buying horses from the nomadic steppe peoples who bred them and selling them to Chinese agents, taking their commission on both sides of the transaction. The wine that the Sogdians produced and traded deserves a moment of appreciation. The Fergana Valley, just east of Sogdiana proper, was famous in Chinese records for its excellent grapes, and the wines of the Zarafshan region were considered luxury goods worth carrying across the trade routes. Chinese poetry of the Tang period refers to Sogdian wine with the enthusiasm that suggests it was genuinely good and not merely exotic. The grape varieties that were grown in Sogdiana are among the ancestors of the grapes now grown across the Islamic world and eventually in Europe, since the Arab conquest ended local wine production in Central Asia, but the knowledge of viticulture traveled westward with the people who had practiced it. The landscape that produced the Sogdians is worth understanding, because the landscape explains everything about the people. Sogdiana was not a simple place to live. It was not a wide, empty steppe where nomads could wander freely, and it was not a fertile floodplain like Egypt or Mesopotamia where a single great river made agriculture easy and predictable. It was a collection of river valleys and oasis settlements in the middle of a vast, difficult landscape, surrounded on multiple sides by desert and mountain ranges and the territories of various nomadic peoples who sometimes traded peacefully and sometimes raided without much warning. The Zarafshan River, whose name means scatterer of gold in the Tajik language, a reference to the gold-bearing silt it carried down from the mountains, was the lifeline of central Sogdiana. It flowed west from the Pamir Mountains through the valleys where Samarkand sat, continuing past the agricultural lands that surrounded the city before eventually disappearing into the desert to the west. The Sogdians became masters of irrigation, building an elaborate system of canals and channels that spread the river's water across the valley floor and made the land around Samarkand one of the most productive agricultural zones in Central Asia. Fruit orchards, grain fields, vineyards. Yes, the Sogdians produced wine, and good wine at that, something they were rather proud of and happy to export. All of this grew in the carefully managed landscape of the Zarafshan Valley. This agricultural base was important, But it was not what made the Sogdians extraordinary. What made them extraordinary was their relationship with what lay beyond the valleys. Because while Sogdiana itself was fertile and productive, it was also located at the exact center of the most important trade route in the ancient world. Samarkand sat at the point where the roads connecting China in the east with Persia and the Mediterranean world in the west intersected with the roads running north to south between the Russian steppes and India. Any caravan traveling between the major civilizations of Eurasia either passed through Samarkand or came very close to it. And the Sogdians, with their language skills and their commercial instincts and their tolerance for the discomfort of long-distance travel, were perfectly positioned to make themselves indispensable to that traffic. The city-state structure of Sogdiana is worth noting. Unlike the great empires that surrounded them, the Persian Empire, the Chinese Han and Tang dynasties, the later Arab Caliphate, the Sogdians never built a single unified state. Sogdiana was a collection of independent cities, each with its own ruler, its own local aristocracy, its own customs and political arrangements. Samarkand was the largest and most prominent, but Bukhara, Panjakent, Khujand, Kesh, and a dozen smaller centers all maintained their independence. The Sogdian cities sometimes cooperated and sometimes competed, but they never merged into a single empire with a capital and an army and a treasury. This looks, from the outside, like a weakness. And in certain ways it was. When a powerful conqueror arrived with the intention of taking Sogdiana, there was no unified military force capable of stopping them. Alexander the Great's campaigns in the region in the late 320s BCE were long and difficult, but they eventually succeeded. The Arab conquest of the early 8th century CE eventually succeeded too. The lack of political unity was a real vulnerability. But in other ways, the decentralized structure was a strength. Because a Sogdian merchant who got into trouble in one city-state could move to another. A community that was taxed too heavily by one ruler could shift its operations to a neighboring territory. The commercial networks that the Sogdians built were not dependent on any single political center. They were distributed, redundant, resilient. When one node of the network was disrupted, trade flowed around it through other nodes. This is a structure that modern computer networks use deliberately, because it turns out that distributed networks are very hard to destroy. The Sogdians discovered this principle about 1,500 years before the internet was invented. The Zarafshan Valley also connected Sogdiana to the mountain passes of the Pamirs to the east, the gateway to China and the Eastern Silk Road. Any merchant traveling from China to the west had to cross the Pamir Mountains, a brutal, high-altitude crossing that could kill unprepared travelers, and then descend into the Zarafshan Valley before continuing west toward Persia or north toward the Russian steppes. Samarkand was the first major city they reached. The hospitality it offered and the commercial opportunities it provided were the foundation of the entire Sogdian trading empire. Historians still argue about whether the Sogdians created the Silk Road or simply benefited from it, and the honest answer is that the question may be slightly backwards. The routes existed before the Sogdians dominated them, but the specific commercial infrastructure, the caravanserais spaced at convenient intervals, the banking systems that allowed merchants to deposit silver in one city and withdraw it in another city thousands of miles away, the family networks that created a web of trust stretching from China to the Mediterranean. Much of that was Sogdian creation. They did not invent the routes. They made the routes work. The Panjakent site, when archaeologists finally fully documented it in the decades after 1946, revealed something that changed the understanding of Sogdian social structure. The houses of even moderately prosperous merchants in this medium-sized city were decorated with wall paintings. Not just the houses of the very wealthy, not just the public buildings and temples. Private residential houses, belonging to people who were comfortable but not aristocrats, had multiple rooms with painted walls. 1 in 3 of the approximately 130 excavated houses preserves evidence of murals. This tells you something about the culture's priorities. A society in which ordinary commercial families spend money decorating their homes with complex narrative paintings is a society that places high value on visual storytelling, on the display of cultural knowledge, on the connection between a household and the broader world of stories and traditions that the paintings reference. It is a society with a middle class wealthy enough to afford this kind of investment and culturally confident enough to know what they wanted painted. The organization of Sogdian society in general was more egalitarian than the rigid aristocratic hierarchies of neighboring cultures, though egalitarian is relative in the ancient world and should not be overstated. The evidence from documents and paintings suggests that successful merchants occupied a social status comparable to the landed aristocracy, that commercial wealth was considered as respectable as wealth from land, which was not the case in many ancient societies that looked down on trade as an unworthy occupation. This made the Sogdian merchant class genuinely powerful within their cities, not merely rich, but socially respected and politically influential. Women in Sogdian society had a degree of economic agency that was unusual by the standards of neighboring cultures. The Sogdian ancient letters document women managing businesses, conducting commercial negotiations, and maintaining their own financial resources. Women appear in the Ponjicant murals not merely as decorative figures, but as participants in the commercial and social life depicted, hosting, trading, making decisions. The property law that can be reconstructed from surviving Sogdian legal documents gave women clearer rights to own and dispose of property than was typical in Persian or Chinese law of the same period. This was not equality in any modern sense, but it was a practical accommodation to the needs of a commercial society in which family businesses needed all their adult members to be functionally capable of conducting commercial affairs. Here is your reality check for the evening, delivered with affection and zero apology. If you had been a Sogdian merchant in the 6th century CE, setting out from Samarkand on a trading journey to China, you would almost certainly not survive this particular career choice. Not because the Sogdians were reckless, they were actually famously careful and methodical, but because the sheer physical demands of Silk Road travel in this period were brutal in ways that are hard to fully picture from the comfort of a bed or a sofa in the modern world. The journey from Samarkand to Chang'an, the Tang dynasty capital of China that is now the modern city of Xi'an, covered roughly 3,000 miles. 3,000 miles, on foot and on horseback, through some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. The Pamir Mountains, which had to be crossed near the beginning of the eastward journey, reach heights of over 23,000 feet, and the high passes where the trade routes threaded through could be closed by snow for months at a time. The Taklamakan Desert, which the caravan skirted on either its northern or southern edge, was, and remains, one of the most inhospitable places on the planet. Its name means something close to "you go in, you don't come out" in the Uyghur language, which is the kind of warning you should probably take seriously. The average Sogdian merchant started their trading career young. Boys from trading families were sent on their first journeys at around 12 years old, accompanying experienced older relatives as apprentices, learning the routes, the languages, the customs of the peoples they traded with, the techniques of evaluating goods and negotiating prices, and managing the complex logistics of moving heavy loads of valuable merchandise across thousands of miles. By the time a Sogdian merchant was in his 20s, he had typically already been to China and back more than once. They traveled in caravans, large, organized groups of merchants traveling together for mutual protection and shared logistical support. A large caravan might include hundreds of camels, dozens of merchants from various origins, professional guards, cooks, and the caravan master who coordinated the whole enterprise. The camel was the essential technology of the Silk Road and the Bactrian camel. The two-humped variety, native to Central Asia, was the specific technology of the Sogdian trade network. These animals could carry loads of several hundred pounds, survive for days without water, withstand both the searing heat of desert travel and the biting cold of mountain passes, and they moved at a pace that, while not fast by any modern standard, was steady and reliable across terrain that would have been impassable for wheeled vehicles. The Sogdians were multilingual as a professional necessity. A merchant who could only speak one language could only trade with one kind of people, which was commercially limiting. Sogdian was the home language, but successful merchants also typically knew Chinese, various Turkic languages spoken by the nomadic peoples of the steppe, Bactrian, the language of neighboring Bactria, and often some Persian and Sanskrit. This wasn't unusual intelligence or academic achievement. It was professional training, the way a modern international business person might speak 3 or 4 languages as a standard job requirement. They also had a specific physical look that Chinese artists of the Tang dynasty found fascinating enough to record in clay. Tang tomes have yielded hundreds of ceramic figurines depicting Sogdian merchants, and they are instantly recognizable. men with large noses, full beards, deep-set eyes, and the characteristic long robes and pointed hats of Central Asian fashion. These figures were made by Chinese artists to place in tombs, a tradition that reflected admiration for the Sogdians as important and interesting figures in Tang society. They look, in the artistic conventions of the period, both foreign and familiar. People who were present in Chinese cities regularly enough to become part of the visual vocabulary of the culture. The trading goods that Sogdian merchants carried tell you a great deal about the networks they operated in. Going east toward China, they carried glass objects from the Byzantine and Syrian world, since Chinese craftspeople had not yet mastered the techniques of glass blowing. Silver objects from Persia, which the Chinese considered elegant luxury goods. Horses from the Central Asian steppe, which the Chinese emperors desperately needed for their cavalry and were willing to pay enormous prices for. And, somewhat surprisingly, paper, which the Sogdians had learned to produce from the Chinese and then refined into their own high-quality product. Going west from China, they carried silk. Always silk, the commodity that gave the whole road its name. Jade, spices, and ceramics. And in both directions, they carried something that left no physical trace in the archaeological record, but was arguably more valuable than any of the physical goods: information. News of political conditions, market prices, road conditions, the rise and fall of rulers. In a world before telegraphs or newspapers or radio, the caravan merchants were the information infrastructure of Eurasia. The banking system that the Sogdians developed was, by any standard, an extraordinary piece of financial innovation for its time. Modern historians who study it tend to use phrases like surprisingly sophisticated and remarkably advanced, which is scholar speak for we weren't expecting anything this clever from people in the 5th century. The core problem that the Sogdian banking system solved was this. If you are a merchant setting out on a journey of several thousand miles, you cannot carry your capital in silver coins for the entire trip. Silver is heavy. A small fortune in silver coins weighs more than you want to carry across the Pamir Mountains on a horse. It also attracts bandits, which is a practical problem with a very direct downside. And if you need to operate in markets where multiple different currencies are in use, constantly exchanging between them is expensive and cumbersome. The Sogdian solution was something that looks remarkably like a medieval version of a letter of credit. A merchant in Samarkand could deposit silver with a trusted business partner, typically a relative, since the family network was the foundation of the system, and receive a document in return. When the merchant arrived in Chang'an 3,000 miles to the east, he could present that document to the Sogdian business network in the city and receive the equivalent value in local currency, minus a fee. The silver stayed in Samarkand. The value traveled. This is essentially what banks do today with international wire transfers, except the Sogdians were doing it 1,500 years ago using papyrus and clay seals and the specific social technology of family trust. The family network was genuinely the infrastructure of the whole system. Sogdian merchant families maintained members in all the major nodes of their trading network simultaneously. Eldest son stays in Samarkand and manages the home base. Second son goes to Chang'an and manages the China operations. Daughter marries into a well-connected family in Bukhara and helps maintain commercial relationships there. Brother-in-law handles operations in the Fergana Valley. This wasn't nepotism in the modern sense. It was a rational response to the fact that trust is very hard to establish with strangers across great distances when you have no legal system spanning the entire network and no courts you can appeal to if a business partner cheats you. Family members are less likely to cheat you, and if they do, there are social consequences that reach far beyond the commercial relationship. The Sogdians also developed sophisticated partnership structures for individual trading ventures. A wealthy merchant in Samarkand might provide the capital for a trading expedition, while a younger, more mobile member of the community provided the labor of actually making the journey. The profits were split according to agreed-upon formulas, with the traveling merchant typically receiving a larger share as compensation for the physical risks of the journey. These arrangements are documented in Sogdian language contracts that have survived in the dry climate of Central Asian archaeological sites, and they show a level of legal and commercial sophistication that is impressive by any historical standard. The cities of Sogdiana themselves were organized around commercial life in ways that reflect this economic culture. Samarkand, based on the archaeological evidence from the site known as Eurasia, the mound that represents the pre-Islamic city, was a substantial urban center with streets laid out on a roughly grid pattern, a citadel where the ruler lived, a commercial district with covered markets, and residential neighborhoods where the merchant families maintained large, comfortable houses. These houses were not merely functional. They were decorated with elaborate wall paintings, had multiple rooms organized around internal courtyards, and featured the kind of infrastructure that suggests significant wealth and a sophisticated urban culture. The wall paintings in particular are a treasure trove. We will spend more time on those later, because they deserve their own section. But for now, simply note that a city where ordinary merchant families decorated their private homes with large-scale multi-figure paintings depicting scenes from literature, mythology, and daily life was a city with a confident cultural identity and the resources to express it. Historians still argue about the specific mechanisms by which the Sogdian banking system connected to other financial systems of the period, particularly the Persian Sassanid system to the west and the Chinese imperial financial system to the east. The details of how Sogdian silver coins interacted with Chinese bronze cash coins in actual commercial transactions are not fully understood from the surviving evidence. What is clear is that both Chinese and Byzantine merchants were willing to accept Sogdian silver as a standard of value, which tells you something important about how the network was trusted by outsiders as well as insiders. The Sogdian credit system worked in ways that seem almost paradoxically simple compared to the complexity of what it enabled. The fundamental building block was trust, and the fundamental generator of trust was family. A Sogdian merchant doing business with a stranger was always trying to establish, as quickly as possible, a connection that transformed the stranger into a known quantity within the network. Sometimes this was done through formal partnership agreements. Sometimes it was done through marriage. Sogdian merchants who settled in Chinese cities often married into local families, and these marriages were commercial as much as personal, creating kinship bonds that could serve the same trust function as actual family ties. The silver currency that circulated through the Sogdian network was itself a product of sophisticated commercial thinking. The coins minted by the various Sogdian city-states were designed to be easily recognizable and consistent in silver content, making them useful in markets far beyond Sogdiana itself. Byzantine merchants accepted Sogdian silver. Chinese merchants accepted it. The Persian Sassanid Empire's silver coins were also widely accepted, and the Sogdians minted imitations of Sassanid coins that circulated alongside the originals in many markets, a practice that tells you something about the pragmatic commercial intelligence of a people who recognized that a familiar-looking coin was easier to use than an unfamiliar one. The goods that the Sogdians carried were not only luxury goods, though luxury goods were the most valuable part of the trade. The logistics of moving heavy quantities of basic commodities, grain, metal, leather, timber, across the Silk Road were substantial, but the returns were real. The Chinese needed Central Asian horses so badly that they organized formal horse-for-silk exchanges with specific exchange rates set by imperial decree. 5 bolts of silk for 1 horse was a commonly cited rate, though the actual terms varied by the quality of both the horse and the silk. A Sogdian merchant who could consistently deliver quality horses to Chinese markets had a business with predictable demand and reliable pricing, which was exactly the kind of business that the Sogdian commercial networks were built to support. The Sogdian ancient letters are 5 pieces of paper that survived 16 centuries in a sealed container in a desert watchtower, and they are among the most remarkable historical documents in existence. Not because they record great events or the decisions of powerful rulers. They don't. They are ordinary correspondence, business letters, personal news, complaints about conditions on the road. They are remarkable precisely because of their ordinariness, because they give us a window into the everyday lives of real Sogdian people in a way that almost no other source from this period can. The letters were found in 1907 by a British-Hungarian archaeologist named Aurel Stein during one of his expeditions to the desert regions of northwestern China. He was exploring a watchtower on the ancient frontier wall west of the oasis city of Dunhuang, about 90 miles from the town itself, at what was essentially the western edge of Chinese imperial territory. Inside the tower, among the debris of its long abandonment, he found what appeared to be a leather bag that had been sealed and left there, as it turned out, for approximately 1,600 years. Inside the bag were 5 letters, preserved by the extraordinary dryness of the desert air, written in Sogdian script on paper. The paper itself was remarkable. The letters predated the earliest surviving Chinese paper documents by decades, making them the oldest surviving paper documents found outside of China. Scholars spent years deciphering the script and the language before the contents could be read. When they finally were, the picture they revealed was extraordinary. The letters were written around 313 CE, during a period of serious political instability in China. The Jin dynasty that had reunified the country after the chaos of the Three Kingdoms period was itself beginning to crumble, and various regional powers were fighting each other with the kind of enthusiasm that tends to be very bad for everyone who isn't directly involved in the fighting. The Xiongnu, a nomadic confederacy from the northern steppes, had taken advantage of the chaos and were raiding deep into Chinese territory. The city of Luoyang had been sacked. Famine was spreading. The emperor had fled. Letter 2 was written by a Sogdian agent named Nanai Vandak, stationed somewhere in the Chinese province of Gansu, to his business partners in Samarkand. His letter is a news report. The capital has been burned. The emperor has fled. Famine is spreading across the central provinces, and thousands of people are dying. He describes the situation with the matter-of-fact tone of a businessman reporting market conditions, which is exactly what he was doing. His letter was never delivered. It was caught up in whatever disaster overtook the postal system during the chaos he was describing. But because it was never delivered, it was never destroyed. And 1,600 years later, it gave historians their most vivid first-hand account of the end of the Jin dynasty's stability. But it is letters 1 and 3 that most people find most compelling, because they are personal rather than commercial. These two letters were written by a Sogdian woman named Mune, whose name, scholars have translated, means something like little tiger or tiger cub, who had followed her husband to Dunhuang and had been abandoned there, left without money or support, unable to return home, surviving as a servant in a Chinese household. In letter 1, Mune wrote to her mother. She described her situation with a dignity that makes the reading of it, even in translation, unexpectedly moving. She had tried to find someone to escort her back home. She had tried to borrow money from the Sogdian community in Dunhuang. Nobody would help her. She and her young daughter Shane were living on the charity of a Zoroastrian priest. She did not know when or whether she would see her mother again. In letter 3, written to her absent husband Nanai Dat, the same dignity is present. She opens with formal greetings, the proper forms of address for a wife writing to a husband. And then, after the formalities, the real feeling comes through. She described how she had obeyed his command and come to Dunhuang, leaving her family behind against their advice. She described how she had written to him again and again without receiving a single reply. She described her loneliness and her poverty, and then she let him know, with a clarity that a 1,600-year interval does nothing to soften, exactly what she thought of a husband who abandoned his wife and child on the edge of the world without money or news. I would rather be a dog's wife or a pig's wife than yours. This is the oldest known complaint letter written by a woman that has survived in history. It is spectacular. What happened to Mune after this, we don't know. What happened to Nanai Dat? Whether he survived the chaos he had disappeared into, whether he was killed by Xiongnu raiders, whether he simply decided not to come back, we also don't know. The letters were never delivered. They were sealed in a bag and left in a watchtower, perhaps by someone who had been trying to carry them and could no longer continue. And they sat there waiting to be found until a stubborn archaeologist with an eye for debris made his way to exactly the right place. The watchtower, where Aurel Stein found the mailbag in 1907, was one of a string of defensive structures that marked the western boundary of Chinese-controlled territory in the 4th century CE. The tower itself was built of rammed earth, the standard construction technique of Chinese frontier fortifications, and had been abandoned centuries before Stein arrived. The bag of letters had been left in the tower, perhaps by a postal courier who had been unable to continue the journey westward and had stashed them there, intending to return, perhaps by someone who found the bag abandoned on the road and brought it to the tower for safekeeping. The 5 letters that Stein found were not the only written documents in the collection. There were other fragments, other pieces of Sogdian writing that helped scholars decipher the language. But the 5 letters, because they were relatively complete, and because they told specific stories about specific people in specific situations, became the emblematic documents of Sogdian studies. They were given the name the Sogdian Ancient Letters, which is both slightly redundant and exactly right. They are ancient, and they are letters, and they are Sogdian, and those 3 facts together explain everything important about them. The merchant Nanai Vandak, who wrote Letter 2 with its news of catastrophe in China, was doing something that every Silk Road merchant needed to do: maintaining the information flow that allowed the commercial network to function. A trading network that doesn't know that its eastern terminus is in chaos cannot make good decisions about whether to send more caravans east or to redirect capital elsewhere. Nanai Vandak's letter was market intelligence, as valuable in its way as any physical cargo. The fact that it never reached Samarkand meant that the business partners there had to go on making decisions without the information he was trying to provide. A small human tragedy in the middle of a much larger historical catastrophe. Letter 2's description of the burning of Luoyang and the famine that followed it is the most detailed non-Chinese account of these events in the historical record. Chinese chronicles document the same events from the inside, from the perspective of the imperial court and the Chinese population. Nanai Vandak's letter shows them from the outside, from the perspective of a foreign merchant community trying to understand what was happening to the country they were doing business in and whether it was safe to continue. The specificity of his observations. He names particular cities, describes particular military movements, gives details about the famine conditions, tells us that the Sogdian merchant network was not merely passive recipients of news, but active observers, people who paid careful attention to the political and military conditions of the territories they operated in because their commercial survival depended on that attention. The Sogdians were not the only people trading on the Silk Road, and it is important to be clear about this. Chinese merchants traveled to Central Asia. Persian and Byzantine merchants came east. Indian merchants operated through the mountain passes of the Hindu Kush. Nomadic Turkic peoples traded with everyone they encountered. The Silk Road was not exclusively Sogdian. What made the Sogdians different was the combination of reach, organization, and language that allowed them to connect all these other networks. They were the connective tissue of Eurasian commerce, the intermediaries who made it possible for a piece of Chinese silk to end up in a Roman household, for Byzantine glassware to end up in a Chinese tomb, for Indian mathematical concepts to travel west to eventually influence Arabic scholarship. The Sogdian presence in Tang Dynasty China was remarkable in its depth. In Chang'an, the Tang capital and one of the largest cities in the world at the time, with a population estimated at between 1 and 2 million people, there was a substantial and well-established Sogdian community. The city had a west market, a commercial district that served as the primary hub of Silk Road trade in the capital, and the Sogdians were central to its operation. They ran shops, managed warehouses, operated as translators and brokers, and served as entertainers. Tang China was, culturally, an extraordinarily cosmopolitan place during this period, more open to foreign influence and genuinely curious about the wider world than many later periods of Chinese history. The Tang court embraced foreign music, foreign dance, foreign art, and foreign goods with an enthusiasm that sometimes surprised even the Sogdians. Ladies of the Tang imperial court began dressing in Sogdian fashion, wearing the kaftans and open-front jackets with long, narrow sleeves, the tapered trousers and pointed boots that were the traditional clothing of Sogdian men. This cross-dressing trend, as modern historians have noted with some amusement, became fashionable precisely because it was exotic and foreign, which tells you something interesting about how Tang China saw the Sogdians, as sophisticated and glamorous, something to emulate. The wine shops of Chang'an were largely run by Sogdians. This is documented in Tang literature and in the archaeological record, and it is slightly funny in a way that the Sogdians probably found perfectly natural. Wine was a Sogdian specialty. The vineyards of the Samarkand region produced wine that was considered excellent across the Silk Road world, and bringing their wine culture to China along with their commercial operations was simply good business. Tang poets wrote about the Sogdian wine girls, the young women who served in these establishments, in terms of considerable admiration. The famous poet Li Bai wrote, "A Hu girl's beauty is like a flower, smiling in the spring breeze as she serves wine." This is not exactly high praise for gender equality, but it tells you that the Sogdian presence in Tang China was vivid and culturally visible in ways that went well beyond commercial transactions. The Sogdian dance that became famous in Tang China, called the Sogdian whirl by modern scholars, known in Chinese as Huxuan Wu, which translates as something like the foreign whirling dance, was a performance in which a dancer spun continuously at very high speed, keeping one foot on a small circular carpet without stepping off its boundaries. The speed and duration of the spinning were apparently spectacular, and the visual effect of the narrow-sleeved Sogdian costume billowing outward as the dancer spun was considered beautiful and exotic by Chinese audiences who had nothing quite like it in their own performance traditions. The dance became enormously popular. It spread from the Sogdian merchant community into the general population of Chang'an, from there into the imperial court, and from there into Tang art and poetry in ways that preserved it in the historical record long after the Sogdians themselves had faded from view. Carved stone funerary panels from Sogdian tombs in China depict the dance. Ceramic figurines show dancers in mid-spin. Tang poems describe it. It became part of Chinese cultural vocabulary. Historians still argue about whether the Sogdian whirl originated in Sogdiana itself or was brought there from somewhere else. Possibly India, given the strong Indian artistic influence visible in Sogdian culture, before being carried east to China. The performance tradition is well documented in Tang sources, but its earlier history in Sogdiana proper is less clear. What is not in doubt is that Sogdian performers were the vector by which it entered Chinese culture, and that it became one of the most recognized and beloved foreign cultural imports of the entire Tang period. The relationship between the Sogdian community and the Tang court was not simply commercial. It was cultural in ways that went surprisingly deep for the time, involving genuine aesthetic exchange rather than mere tolerance of foreign presence. The Tang emperor Xuanzong, who ruled from 712 to 756 CE and presided over what is often considered the cultural peak of the Tang dynasty, was personally enthusiastic about Sogdian and Central Asian music and dance. He maintained at his court a troupe of Sogdian musicians and dancers, and the Sogdian whirl was performed at imperial banquets and court ceremonies. Chinese court poetry of the period is full of references to the foreign dancers from the West, their spinning and their wine-red skirts and their quick light feet. This was not merely exotic entertainment. It was a genuine aesthetic appreciation of a foreign tradition by a Chinese ruler who recognized quality when he saw it. The poet Du Fu, one of the greatest writers of the Tang period, wrote about Sogdian dancers. The poet Bai Juye wrote a long poem called Song of the Sogdian Whirl that is both a vivid description of the dance and a political meditation on the foreign influences at the Tang court. Li Bai, possibly the most famous Chinese poet, was himself of Central Asian ancestry. His family appears to have had connections to the Sogdian or related communities of the Silk Road world, and some scholars argue that this background is visible in the slightly non-standard quality of some of his Chinese, as though it was not quite his first language. The Sogdian community of Chang'an maintained its own internal religious and cultural institutions while also participating in Tang Chinese social life. Zoroastrian fire temples, called Jianjiaosei in Chinese, temples of the immortal teaching, operated in the city, serving the religious needs of the Sogdian community. These were not secret or hidden institutions. They were acknowledged parts of the city's religious landscape, listed in official records alongside Buddhist monasteries, Taoist temples, and Nestorian Christian churches. Tang China, under its more cosmopolitan rulers, genuinely accommodated a remarkable range of religious traditions, and the Sogdian community benefited from this tolerance. The relationship between Sogdian merchants and Chinese officials was managed through a system of officially designated heads of the Sogdian community, men who served as intermediaries between the community and the Chinese authorities, representing the Sogdians' interests to the government and the government's requirements to the community. This system of community leadership was common across the various foreign communities in Tang China, and it allowed the Sogdians to maintain a degree of internal self-governance while operating within the Chinese legal and administrative framework. The Chang'an Sogdian community eventually established burial practices that were distinctive products of their position between two worlds. The stone funerary beds found in Sogdian tombs in the Chang'an area, flat platforms carved in low relief with scenes from the deceased's life, are among the most extraordinary objects in the archaeology of the Silk Road. One, belonging to a merchant named Shi Jun who died in 579 CE, shows him hosting a banquet with guests from different cultures, hunting, traveling in a caravan, and participating in Zoroastrian religious ceremonies. The carved images present a biographical statement, a record of a life lived across cultural boundaries, a man who was comfortable in Chinese society and proud of his Sogdian identity simultaneously. Another funerary bed, belonging to a merchant named An Shi, who died in 579 CE as well, shows similar scenes, including a depiction of the Sogdian whirl dance, a dancer spinning at high speed on the platform that was already becoming a Chinese cultural touchstone even at this early date. The pride that these families took in, depicting the Sogdian dance tradition in their most important memorial objects, tells you how central it was to their sense of cultural identity. The religious life of the Sogdians was as complex and multi-layered as everything else about them, and it reflects the same cosmopolitan and everything-is-interesting quality that characterized their commercial and cultural lives. The simple answer to what religion were the Sogdians is, it depends on which Sogdian and when. The traditional religion of Sogdiana was Mazdaism, the broad category of pre-Islamic Iranian religious practice that is sometimes lumped under the term Zoroastrianism, though scholars prefer to distinguish the specific Sogdian version from the more systematic Zoroastrianism of the Persian Sassanid Empire to the west. The Sogdians worshipped a range of Iranian deities and maintained fire temples in their cities, but their religious practice incorporated local elements and influences from neighboring traditions in ways that made it distinctly their own. The goddess Nana, also spelled Nanai, which is the same divine name embedded in the abandoned merchant Nanai-Dat's name from the ancient letters, was one of the most important figures in the Sogdian pantheon. She was a Mesopotamian goddess of love and war who had been adopted into the Iranian religious world and then further adapted by the Sogdians into their own image. Her depictions in Sogdian art show her riding a lion, holding the sun in one hand and the moon in the other, a powerful, independent figure who combined attributes that other cultures typically assign to different deities. Buddhism arrived in Sogdiana through the Silk Road connections that brought everything else, and the Sogdians became important vectors for its spread further along the routes. Sogdian merchants who encountered Buddhist communities in India and in the cities of the Silk Road brought Buddhist texts home, translated them into their own language, and carried translated versions eastward to communities in China and Central Asia. Some of the earliest Buddhist texts in Chinese translation were produced by Sogdian monks working in China, and Sogdian language Buddhist manuscripts have been found across the Silk Road from Afghanistan to Western China. Manichaeism, a complex, syncretic religion founded by a Persian prophet named Mani in the 3rd century CE, which attempted to combine elements of Zoroastrianism, Christianity, and Buddhism into a single system, was another tradition with strong Sogdian connections. Manichaean texts in the Sogdian language have been found in the cave deposits of Dunhuang and Turfan in western China, suggesting an active Manichaean community among Sogdians in those areas. The Sogdian language seems to have been one of the primary languages in which Manichaean scriptures were transmitted eastward. Nestorian Christianity, a branch of Christianity that differed from the Byzantine mainstream on questions of theology, particularly about the nature of Christ, and that had spread eastward across Persia and Central Asia, also had some Sogdian adherents, though this appears to have been the smallest of the major religious traditions among them. What is remarkable about this religious situation is not merely the variety, it is the apparent tolerance. The archaeological evidence from Sogdian cities shows temples and religious spaces for multiple traditions existing in close proximity, sometimes within the same city block. The murals of Panjakant, which we will explore in detail shortly, depict scenes from Hindu mythology alongside scenes from Iranian epic tradition alongside what appear to be purely local religious practices, all in the same building. This was not tolerance in the modern political sense of a carefully negotiated coexistence. It was something more organic, the practical open-mindedness of a commercial people who needed to do business with representatives of many different religious traditions and found it easier to understand and appreciate those traditions than to condemn them. This religious flexibility was a significant commercial asset. A Sogdian merchant who could participate in Buddhist ceremonies when in India, fire temple rituals when home in Samarkand, and Nestorian Christian services when traveling in Persian-controlled territory was a merchant who could establish trust and social connections with a much wider range of potential partners than someone committed to a single, exclusive religious framework. The fire temples of Sogdiana are among the most interesting religious monuments in the archaeological record of Central Asia, partly because they have been so difficult to categorize. They are Iranian temples, worshipping in a tradition connected to Zoroastrianism, but they are distinctly Sogdian in their form and in the specific deities they honored. Archaeologists excavating at Panjakant found 2 temples side by side. one apparently dedicated to Ajva, the principal male deity of the Sogdian pantheon, and one dedicated to Nana, the goddess who had come originally from Mesopotamia and been adapted into the Sogdian religious world over centuries. The coexistence of these temples and the specific character of the deities honored in them tells us something important about how Sogdian religion worked. It was not a strict, systematic theology of the kind that the Zoroastrian religious establishment of the Sassanid Persian Empire had developed. A religion with authoritative scriptures, priestly hierarchies, and specific doctrines about what could and could not be worshipped. It was a more fluid, locally rooted practice that honored the deities most important to the specific community while remaining open to incorporating new religious influences from the wider world. When Buddhism arrived along the Silk Road from India, the Sogdians did not need to choose between their existing religious practice and the new tradition. They could honor both. When Manichaeism arrived from Persia with its sophisticated theological system combining elements of Zoroastrian, Christian, and Buddhist thought, they could find it interesting and useful without abandoning what they already had. This religious flexibility was not confusion or lack of conviction. It was a sophisticated understanding that different religious systems addressed different human needs, and that a trading people who needed to establish trust with representatives of many different religious traditions had good practical reasons for approaching all of those traditions with respect and genuine curiosity. The Manichaean texts found in the Sogdian language are particularly interesting in this context. Manichaeism was, among other things, a missionary religion. It sent missionaries along the trade routes to spread the teachings of Mani, and Sogdian was one of the languages in which Manichaean scripture was translated and circulated. The fact that substantial Sogdian language Manichaean literature has been preserved suggests that there was a real Sogdian Manichaean community that was reading and copying these texts, not just a small group of isolated converts. How this community related to the Sogdians who maintained the fire temples, or those who had become Buddhist, is something historians have debated at length without fully resolving. The physical evidence of Sogdian fire worship is visible in the archaeological record in a somewhat unexpected form, ossuaries. Zoroastrian practice did not bury the dead in the ground. This would pollute the earth, but instead exposed the body to be cleaned by birds and then collected the bones in small clay or stone containers called ossuaries. Sogdian ossuaries have been found across the region in considerable numbers, and they are often decorated with carved scenes of religious significance. The judgment of the soul, the eternal fire, divine figures. They are among the most intimate and personal objects in the Sogdian archaeological record, created to honor the dead and preserve their remains in a form consistent with their religious beliefs. The city of Panjshir, now a small town in modern Tajikistan, about 60 kilometers east of Samarkand, was, in the 6th, 7th, and 8th centuries CE, a medium-sized Sogdian city of perhaps 10 to 15,000 people, located on a high valley terrace above the Zarafshan River. It was not the largest or most important Sogdian city. That was Samarkand, and it was not particularly famous in its own time for anything unusual. It was just a prosperous, well-organized Sogdian community going about its business in the normal way, which involved considerable trade, religious practice, artistic production, and the kind of comfortable urban life that the Sogdians had built for themselves in their fertile river valleys. Then, sometime in the 720s CE, the Arab armies that had been gradually conquering Central Asia reached the Zarafshan Valley. The population of Panjshir had time to evacuate, or most of it did, and they apparently left in something of a hurry, abandoning their homes with their contents still inside. The city was then never fully reoccupied, at least not by the same culture. It sat, gradually silting over with the dust of centuries, while the world around it changed beyond recognition. Soviet archaeologists began systematic excavations at the site in 1946, and what they found over the following decades was astounding. The dryness of the Central Asian climate, combined with the abandonment of the site before anyone had time to systematically strip it of its valuable materials, meant that the houses of Panjshir had preserved an extraordinary record of Sogdian life. And the most spectacular part of that record was the wall paintings. In a Sogdian city of the 6th through 8th centuries, wealthy households decorated their main reception rooms with large-scale murals covering entire walls from floor to ceiling. These were not simple decorative patterns. They were complex narrative paintings depicting scenes from mythology, epic literature, everyday life, religious ceremonies, and stories borrowed from the wider literary world of the Silk Road. Among the approximately 130 houses excavated at Panjikent, roughly 1 in 3 has preserved traces of murals. In the most intact rooms, the paintings survive in substantial enough condition to tell stories. One of the most remarkable murals depicts scenes from the Rustam cycle. The heroic adventures of the warrior Rustam, a figure from Iranian epic tradition who would later be incorporated into Ferdowsi's great 11th century Persian epic, the Shahnameh. The Panjikent version predates Ferdowsi by centuries and shows the Sogdians engaging deeply with the same Iranian narrative tradition that would later produce one of the greatest works of Persian literature. The hero is shown in battle, in supernatural encounters, in moments of triumph and danger, with a visual dynamism and narrative confidence that suggests a tradition of illustrated storytelling already well developed. Other murals depict scenes that scholars have identified as coming from the Panchatantra, the famous collection of Indian animal fables that originated in Sanskrit and traveled across the world through the Silk Road networks. The fable of the hare and the lion appears in one painting. Scenes from Aesop's fables, the Greek collection that had traveled east along the routes, appear in another. The Panjikent murals are a library painted on walls, a record of the stories that moved along the Silk Road and found their way into the visual imagination of a prosperous Sogdian community in the Zarafshan Valley. The paintings also show us scenes of everyday life. Banquets where richly dressed figures recline on cushions and drink wine from elaborate vessels while musicians play, guests from different cultural backgrounds visible in the variety of dress and facial features. Hunting scenes showing the aristocratic sport of the period, religious ceremonies with priests and sacred fires, battle scenes with armored warriors. And, in one of the most famous images, a panel showing a seated woman being presented with tribute by figures of various cultural backgrounds. An image that some scholars read as a depiction of the Sogdian trading world itself, with its connections to every corner of the known world. Many of the Panjikent murals are now in the collection of the State Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, which acquired them during the Soviet period. Others are in the National Museum of Antiquities of Tajikistan in Dushanbe. They are extraordinary objects, faded and fragmentary in places, but still vivid enough that, looking at them, you feel something of the life of the people who painted them looking back at you across 14 centuries. The temples of Panjikent were excavated with extraordinary care by Soviet archaeologists who recognized immediately that they were dealing with an unusually rich site, the main temple of the city. Apparently dedicated to the deity Adva, the principal Sogdian god, was a substantial structure with multiple rooms, fire altars, and painted walls. The second temple, dedicated to Nana, was similarly elaborate, with the clay statue of the goddess placed in a specific orientation that scholars have interpreted as ritually significant. But it was the private houses that produced the most remarkable murals, because they showed domestic life rather than public ceremony. In a wealthy merchant's reception room in Panjikent, the walls might be covered from floor to ceiling with paintings organized into horizontal bands, each band containing a narrative sequence. A story told in sequential images, the way a modern film tells a story in sequential frames. The style is distinctively Sogdian. Figures shown in a slightly frontal, slightly flat way that owes something to Persian artistic conventions but has its own character with vivid colors, reds, blues, greens, yellows, and a remarkable attention to the details of clothing and accessories that allows modern scholars to reconstruct Sogdian fashion with unusual accuracy. The colors have survived with extraordinary vividness in many of the best preserved sections, which is partly a testament to the quality of the pigments the Sogdian painters used. Minerals ground to fine powder and mixed with organic binders, applied to plaster surfaces in techniques that have proven highly durable, and partly a consequence of the dry conditions of the Central Asian climate, which have preserved organic materials that would have rotted in more humid environments. One of the most famous individual images from the Panjikent murals is the blue-faced deity, a large painted figure with blue skin riding a lion, identified by scholars as Nana, the Sogdian goddess. The blue skin is a convention borrowed from Indian artistic traditions, where certain deities are depicted in blue, and its presence in a Sogdian painting is a vivid reminder of how thoroughly the Indian artistic influence had penetrated Sogdian visual culture. The deity's expression is calm and powerful, her position on the lion's back suggesting absolute control over a dangerous force, and the painting as a whole has a compositional confidence that speaks of a well-established artistic tradition operating at its peak. The Eurasia mural, found at the site of ancient Samarkand rather than at Panjikent, shows a different kind of image, a formal diplomatic reception. The Sogdian ruler of Samarkand is shown receiving delegations from various foreign powers, each group dressed in their own distinctive cultural style. Scholars have identified Chinese figures, Indian figures, Korean figures, and figures from various Central Asian and steppe cultures in this single painting, which was on the wall of the palace's main reception hall. It is, in effect, a map of the Sogdian world. All the connections radiating outward from Samarkand toward the civilizations with which it maintained relationships. The discovery in 2022 to 2023 at a site near Panjikent called Sanjar Shah added another piece to the Sogdian religious picture. Fragments of a wall painting showing a procession of priests approaching a large fire altar, the first clear depiction of fire worship rituals in Sogdian painting. The painting confirms what scholars had argued from textual evidence, that fire temples and fire rituals were central to Sogdian religious life, but gives it a visual specificity that was previously missing. The priests are shown in the distinctive white robes of Iranian fire worship, holding the sacred barsim bundles, their faces covered as they approach the holy flame. It is a snapshot of a religious moment frozen in paint 14 centuries ago. The Sogdian language deserves its own careful attention, because it is one of those languages that managed to be extraordinarily important for a few centuries and then leave almost no direct descendants. Yet its influence on the world's writing systems is so profound that it can be traced all the way to Mongolia and Manchuria and the Qing dynasty that ruled China until 1912. Sogdian was an Eastern Iranian language, meaning it belonged to the same broad family as Old Persian and Avestan, but was distinct enough to be its own tongue with its own grammar and vocabulary. It was written using a script derived from the Aramaic alphabet, the ancient Semitic writing system that was itself the ancestor of Hebrew and Arabic script, adapted for the specific sound system of the Sogdian language. The script was written right to left, like Arabic and Hebrew, and was at first used primarily for inscriptions and formal documents, but over time, a faster, more cursive version developed for everyday correspondence and commercial use. It is this cursive form that appears in the ancient letters, and in the merchant documents, and in the Buddhist and Manichaean religious texts that the Sogdians produced. The language became, by the 4th century CE, the common language of trade and communication across Central Asia, what modern linguists call a lingua franca. Merchants from different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds who needed to communicate with each other along the Silk Road used Sogdian as their common medium. Chinese records of the period refer to Sogdian as the language of commerce throughout the region. Diplomatic correspondence between various Central Asian powers was sometimes conducted in Sogdian. Buddhist missionaries traveling along the Silk Road wrote in Sogdian. Rock inscriptions in mountain passes, the ancient equivalent of graffiti left by travelers, have been found in Sogdian script in valleys from Afghanistan to northern Pakistan, marking the routes that Sogdian merchants traveled. The script and the language also spread into new communities in ways that produced lasting effects. When Sogdian merchants established trading communities among the Turkic peoples of the Central Asian steppe, the Uyghur Turks, the Guk Turks, they brought literacy with them. The Turkic peoples, who had been primarily oral cultures without writing systems of their own, adapted the Sogdian script to write their own languages. This adaptation produced the Old Uyghur alphabet, which was the writing system of the powerful Uyghur Empire of the 8th through 10th centuries. Then something remarkable happened. When Genghis Khan conquered Central Asia in the 13th century and established the Mongol Empire, his forces captured a Uyghur scribe named Tata Tonga, who knew the Old Uyghur alphabet. Genghis Khan recognized that his empire needed a writing system and instructed Tata Tonga to adapt the Uyghur script, which was itself descended from Sogdian, for the Mongolian language. The result was the traditional Mongolian script, which is still used in Inner Mongolia today. And then, in the late 16th century, the Manchu ruler Nurhaci decided that his people needed their own writing system separate from Mongolian, and the Mongolian script was adapted once more to create the Manchu alphabet, which was used as the official writing system of the Qing dynasty of China until its collapse in 1912. So, Sogdian script, adapted to Uyghur, adapted to Mongolian, adapted to Manchu. The official writing system of one of the great Chinese imperial dynasties was the great-great-grandchild of the script that Sogdian merchants used to write business letters in the 4th century CE. This is not a metaphor or an approximation. It is a direct, documented line of descent, traceable script feature by script feature through each adaptation. One notable quirk happened somewhere along this chain of transmission. When the Sogdian script was adapted into Old Uyghur, it was rotated 90 degrees. Sogdian was written horizontally from right to left, like Arabic. Old Uyghur was written vertically, from top to bottom, left to right. Why this rotation happened is not fully understood. Scholars offer various theories, but none that are conclusive. What it produced is the uniquely vertical writing direction of the Mongolian and Manchu scripts, one of the most visually distinctive features of those writing systems. Historians still argue about the full extent of Sogdian linguistic influence on Chinese. Whether specific vocabulary items, particularly in the areas of trade and commerce, entered Chinese through Sogdian rather than directly from other languages. The evidence is complex and the debates are technical, but the broader point is clear. A language that is now extinct left fingerprints on writing systems used by hundreds of millions of people. The specific mechanics of how the Sogdian script became the Old Uyghur script are worth tracing more carefully, because the story involves both a cultural encounter and a deliberate act of translation and adaptation that is, in its own way, as remarkable as any of the more famous translation projects of the Silk Road period. The Göktürk Khaganate, the great Turkic empire that dominated the Central Asian steppe in the 6th and 7th centuries CE, used Sogdian for its official inscriptions and administrative correspondence, even though the Göktürks themselves spoke a Turkic language. Sogdian was the bureaucratic language of the steppe empire, the way Latin was the bureaucratic language of medieval Europe long after it had ceased to be anyone's native tongue. Sogdian scribes served in Göktürk courts, maintaining the administrative machinery that a large empire requires. When the Uyghur Turks established their own empire in 744 CE, replacing the Göktürks as the dominant power on the steppe, they inherited both the administrative traditions and the scribal personnel of the previous empire. Over time, the Uyghurs adapted the Sogdian script to write their own Turkic language, adding extra letters for sounds that Sogdian did not have, modifying existing letters to better represent Turkic phonology, creating what is now called the Old Uyghur alphabet. This was not a casual or accidental process. It was a deliberate cultural project, the creation of a written form of Uyghur that would allow the language to be used for literature and administration in the way that Sogdian had been used before it. The Old Uyghur script was subsequently used for a remarkable range of literary production. Buddhist texts were translated from Sanskrit and Chinese into Uyghur using this script. Administrative documents, legal codes, commercial contracts were written in it. Uyghur became, through this script, one of the literate languages of the medieval Silk Road world, and the script was the direct gift of the Sogdian scribal tradition to the Turkic cultural world. When Genghis Khan captured the Uyghur scribe Tata Tonga during his Central Asian campaigns in the early 13th century, he recognized immediately the value of what he had captured. The Mongols were a formidable military force but had no written language. Tata Tonga's knowledge of the Uyghur alphabet, which was itself Sogdian in origin, gave Genghis Khan the tool he needed to create a written administrative system for his emerging empire. The commission to adapt the script for Mongolian was given to Tata Tonga, and the resulting traditional Mongolian script, still in use in Inner Mongolia today, is the direct descendant of the Sogdian commercial alphabet. The storytelling tradition of the Sogdians is something that rarely gets the attention it deserves, which is partly because stories leave fewer durable traces in the archaeological record than coins or ceramics or wall paintings. But the evidence we have is striking enough to deserve careful attention, because it suggests that the Sogdians were not merely carriers of other people's stories, but active producers and adapters of narrative in their own right. The wall paintings of Panjakent, as we have already seen, show scenes from a remarkable range of literary sources. Iranian epic tradition, Indian Panchatantra fables, what appear to be adaptations of Greek Aesop stories. But they also show scenes that scholars cannot definitively trace to any known text. Stories that appear to be Sogdian in origin, depicting heroes and monsters and supernatural encounters in a visual style that suggests a rich narrative tradition now largely lost. At least 42 different literary works have been identified in the Panjakent murals alone. A culture that painted 42 different stories on its walls was a culture that cared deeply about stories and had a lot of them. The Sogdians were the vectors by which the Panchatantra, the great Indian collection of animal fables about wisdom, strategy, and human nature, traveled westward and eventually reached the Arab, Persian, and European literary traditions. The Panchatantra was translated into Pahlavi, the language of the Sassanid Persian Empire, at some point in the 6th century CE, a translation that was then used as the basis for an Arabic version called Kalila and Dimna, which became one of the most influential books in the medieval Islamic world and eventually made its way into European literary tradition. The Sogdians, with their connections running from India to Persia to Central Asia, were positioned at exactly the right point in this chain of transmission to have been the agents of its initial westward movement. Fragments of the Panchatantra in Sogdian have been found among the manuscripts recovered from the Turfan Oasis and the Dunhuang cave deposits, some of the greatest storehouses of ancient Central Asian manuscripts in existence. These fragments confirm that Sogdian language versions of the Indian fables existed, that they were being actively copied and circulated in the Sogdian-speaking communities of Central Asia, and that the stories had been adapted and absorbed into the Sogdian literary tradition rather than simply translated as foreign texts. The Sogdians were also important in the transmission of Buddhist literature, and this was storytelling of a particular kind. The Buddhist Jataka tales, the stories of the previous lives of the Buddha, in which he appears in various forms, animal, human, divine, and demonstrates moral virtue through specific actions, were enormously popular across the Buddhist world and traveled along the Silk Road in multiple languages. Sogdian translations of Jataka tales have been found, and the stories appear in the Panjakant murals, suggesting that these Indian Buddhist narratives had become part of the broader Sogdian literary imagination rather than remaining purely religious texts. The oral storytelling tradition of the Sogdians is harder to document, since spoken stories leave no direct traces. But the evidence of what was painted on walls, what was copied in manuscripts, and what was carried across thousands of miles in the minds of traveling merchants suggests a people who found narrative deeply important. Not just entertainment, but a way of making sense of the world and communicating across cultural boundaries. A merchant who could tell a good story, who knew the fables that resonated in the markets of India and China and Persia, had a social tool as valuable as any commercial skill. Consider the practical value of a shared story. A Sogdian merchant sitting at a campfire in a caravanserai on the road to Chang'an, surrounded by Chinese and Turkic and Persian fellow travelers, who could tell a version of a Panchatantra fable that everyone recognized from their own tradition, translated and adapted to a form familiar to each audience, was a merchant who had just established a connection with everyone within earshot. Stories were relationship technology. The murals also reveal something about how the Sogdians saw themselves in relation to the world's cultures. They did not paint only Iranian stories, or only Indian stories, or only Chinese stories. They painted all of them, mixed together on the same walls, in the same rooms, for the same audiences. This is not cultural confusion or lack of identity. It is the visual expression of a civilization that had decided, quite deliberately, to be at home in all the world's stories at once. The relationship between the Sogdians and the nomadic Turkic peoples of the Central Asian steppe is one of the more interesting and complex chapters in the Sogdian story, and it tells you a great deal about how the Sogdians operated in the political landscape of their world. The steppes north of Sogdiana were home to a succession of powerful nomadic confederacies: the Huns, the Ruran, the Gokturks, the Western Turks, the Uyghurs. These were not the barbaric raiders of popular imagination. They were sophisticated political entities with their own complex social hierarchies, diplomatic traditions, and economic systems. They were also, critically, the people who controlled the northern Silk Road routes, the passes through which merchant caravans had to travel to reach China. The nomadic peoples needed the Sogdians. They wanted the luxury goods that the Silk Road carried: silk, gold, silver, exotic foods, wine. They needed merchants who could trade for these goods, organize the commercial transactions, manage the logistics. The nomads were excellent horsemen and warriors, but they were not commercial specialists. The Sogdians were exactly the commercial specialists they needed. The Sogdians, in turn, needed the nomads. They needed safe passage through the steppe territories. They needed the political protection that came from good relationships with whoever was in control of the routes. And they needed the horses that the steppe peoples raised. The fast, tough Central Asian horses that the Chinese emperors would pay enormous prices for in silk. The result was a relationship of mutual dependence that, at its best, worked extremely well. Sogdian merchants established permanent communities in nomadic capitals, serving as traders and administrators. Sogdian scribes and translators served in nomadic courts, bringing the administrative and diplomatic skills that mobile warrior societies needed but had not developed internally. Sogdian merchants arranged the delivery of Chinese silk to nomadic rulers who used it to pay troops and impress rivals. The relationship also had a cultural dimension. The Sogdians brought writing to the Turkic peoples, as we have seen. They also brought Buddhism and Manichaeism, the urban arts of metalworking and textile production, the culinary traditions of the oasis cities. And they absorbed Turkic cultural elements in return. The nomadic horse culture, certain artistic motifs, words from Turkic languages that entered the Sogdian vocabulary. The relationship was genuinely bidirectional. The political power of the nomads could also be a threat. When a particular nomadic confederation collapsed or was replaced by a rival, the Sogdian communities that had built relationships with the old power needed to quickly establish new relationships with the new one. The decentralized structure of Sogdian society helped here. There was no single Sogdian political entity that could be targeted for destruction, just a network of individual merchant families and communities that could adapt and reconfigure themselves around new political realities. One of the most remarkable political figures of the 8th century was a man named An Lushan, who was of Sogdian and Turkic descent, and who rose through the military ranks of the Tang dynasty to become one of the most powerful generals in the empire. In 755 CE, An Lushan launched a massive rebellion against the Tang imperial court, a rebellion that nearly succeeded, that killed hundreds of thousands of people, and that fundamentally weakened the Tang dynasty in ways from which it never fully recovered. The An Lushan rebellion is sometimes called the Sogdian rebellion by historians who emphasize the Sogdian background of its leader. This framing is somewhat misleading. An Lushan was deeply assimilated into Tang Chinese culture and politics, and his rebellion had complex causes that went well beyond any Sogdian ethnic loyalty. But the fact of his Sogdian heritage and the visibility of Sogdian-descended commanders and officials throughout his movement did contribute to a backlash against the Sogdian community in China after the rebellion was suppressed. The openness and curiosity with which Tang China had embraced Sogdian culture began to contract. The Sogdian quarter of Chang'an became less prominent. The foreigners who had been exotic and glamorous became objects of suspicion. The rebellion of 755 CE is considered one of the turning points in Sogdian history in China. It did not end the Sogdian presence immediately, but it accelerated a process of assimilation and disappearance that was already underway, as Sogdian families adopted Chinese names and customs and gradually merged into the Chinese population over the generations that followed. The Sogdian rock inscriptions found in the mountain valleys of what is today northern Pakistan are among the most evocative physical traces of the Sogdian trading world. The Karakoram Highway, which modern engineers built through the same valleys in the 20th century, follows routes that were used by Silk Road caravans for 2,000 years. And on the rocks alongside those routes, travelers in the ancient period carved their names, their prayers, their drawings of animals and people and Buddhist symbols. Among these inscriptions are hundreds in the Sogdian language and script, dated primarily to the 4th through 8th century CE. They range from simple graffiti, "So-and-so was here," to more elaborate prayers for safe passage and business success. Some record the completion of successful journeys. Others seem to be requests for divine protection before entering particularly dangerous sections of the route. Taken together, they form an extraordinary document of ordinary commercial life. The names of individual merchants, each one a real person who scratched their name or a prayer into rock because they had made it this far and hoped to make it a little further. These inscriptions are now studied using photography and digital enhancement techniques that allow texts that are nearly invisible to the naked eye to be read. New inscriptions are still being found, and each new one adds another name, another moment of human presence, another data point in the reconstruction of the Sogdian trading world. The Sogdian trading network in the Fergana Valley. The long, fertile valley that runs northeast of Samarkand, today divided between Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan, was particularly important for the horse trade. The famous heavenly horses of Fergana, which Chinese emperors had been seeking since the Han dynasty, were bred in this valley, and the Sogdian communities there served as the interface between the horse breeders and the Chinese buyers. The scale of this trade was remarkable. Historical records document the exchange of tens of thousands of bolts of silk for horses in single diplomatic commercial transactions. The Arab conquest of Sogdiana is one of those historical events that unfolded slowly and painfully, with false endings and temporary recoveries, before the final result became clear. Understanding it requires understanding that the Sogdians did not simply give up when faced with conquest. They resisted, negotiated, appealed for help, resisted again, and only gradually accepted that the world they had built over centuries was not coming back. The Arab armies of the Umayyad Caliphate began moving into the Sogdian region in earnest in the early 8th century CE. The commander leading the campaign was a general named Qutayba ibn Muslim, a capable and aggressive military leader who conducted the conquest of Transoxiana, the region beyond the Oxus River, which included most of Sogdiana, between approximately 705 and 715 CE. Bukhara fell in the early stages of the campaign. Samarkand, the greatest prize, fell in 712 CE after a siege and negotiated surrender. The other Sogdian city-states fell one by one. The Sogdians did not accept this lying down. Multiple uprisings followed the initial conquest. Sogdian rulers appealed to the Tang dynasty of China for military assistance, and in some cases received it. A Sogdian king named Gurak, who had held Samarkand when it fell to the Arabs, continued to resist and negotiate for years afterward. In 720 CE, Sogdian rulers sent a letter to the Tang emperor asking for Chinese military intervention to drive out the Arabs, and Tang forces did actually intervene, briefly, in the complex military situation of Central Asia during this period. But the Tang dynasty had its own problems. The pressures that would eventually produce the An Lushan rebellion were already building, and Chinese military commitment to Central Asia was limited and inconsistent. The decisive battle came in 751 CE at the Battle of Talas River, where Arab forces defeated a Tang Chinese army that had been campaigning in the region, ending any possibility of Chinese re-establishment of influence in Sogdiana. After Talas, the Arab position in Central Asia was secure, and the Sogdians were definitively under Islamic rule. The process of Islamization that followed was gradual rather than forced. Arab rulers generally offered non-Muslims the status of dhimmi, protected subjects who could practice their own religion and run their own affairs in exchange for paying a special tax. The financial incentive to convert was significant, but conversion was not required. In Sogdiana, the pace of conversion was relatively slow at first, picking up speed over generations as the social and economic advantages of belonging to the dominant religious community became clearer. What happened more quickly was the decline of the Sogdian language, Persian. Specifically New Persian, the version of the language that was developing in the 9th and 10th centuries and would become the great literary language of the Islamic world east of Arabia, began to replace Sogdian as the language of administration, commerce, and culture. The Samanid dynasty, which ruled the region from the 9th century onward, was a Persian cultural dynasty, and under their patronage, New Persian literature flowered in exactly the cities where Sogdian had been spoken 2 centuries before. Sogdian manuscripts continued to be produced for a time, but as the language ceased to be used for administration and commerce, the community of active speakers shrank generation by generation. By around 1000 CE, Sogdian had largely ceased to exist as a living language. It survived in some remote communities for perhaps another century or two. There is evidence for Sogdian being spoken in some rural areas into the 11th century. But as a cultural and commercial force, the Sogdian language was finished. The people who had spoken it had not disappeared. They had converted, adopted Persian and Turkic, married into neighboring communities, and continued the same commercial and agricultural lives their ancestors had lived, but under a different identity. Historians still argue about whether the Arab conquest should be understood as the primary cause of Sogdian decline, or whether the civilization was already transforming under its own internal pressures before the conquest completed the change. The evidence suggests both factors were real. The Sogdian world was changing anyway, as the Tang dynasty's openness created opportunities for Sogdian assimilation into Chinese culture, and as the Persian literary tradition offered a prestigious alternative to Sogdian cultural identity. The Arab conquest accelerated and completed a process that might eventually have happened more gradually otherwise. The period between the Arab conquest and the complete fading of the Sogdian identity was longer and more complex than the simple narrative of conquered and absorbed suggests. For several generations after 712 CE, Sogdian culture continued to produce remarkable things. The Panjaket murals themselves date primarily from the period between the Arab conquest and the city's final abandonment around 722 to 730 CE. Meaning that Sogdian artists were painting some of their most accomplished work in the period when Arab military control was being established over their region. This is not the behavior of a culture in immediate collapse. It is the behavior of a culture continuing to do what it knows how to do, maintaining its values and traditions even as the political landscape around it changes. The Sogdian refugees who fled the Arab conquest to China and to other parts of the Silk Road carried their skills and their cultural knowledge with them, continuing the Sogdian commercial tradition in places where Arab authority did not reach. Sogdian merchant communities in Tang, China, Sogdian oasis settlements on the northern Silk Road routes, Sogdian descended communities in various Central Asian locations. All of these continued functioning for decades, and in some cases, generations after the political center of Sogdiana had fallen to Arab control. The Sogdian language, as we have seen, did not disappear immediately after the conquest. It continued to be used for commercial and private purposes, and Sogdian language manuscripts continued to be produced and copied for another century or two. The last known Sogdian inscription was carved in the 10th century CE, more than 200 years after the Arab conquest. In a remote valley in what is today Kazakhstan, where a small Sogdian-speaking community had apparently survived in isolation from the main centers of the language's decline. The conversion to Islam among the Sogdians followed its own timeline, influenced by the specific conditions of individual communities and the varying policies of different Arab rulers and their successors. Some communities converted quickly, attracted by the social and economic benefits of belonging to the dominant religion. Others maintained their Zoroastrian or Buddhist or Manichaean practices for generations, paying the dhimmi tax that the Islamic legal system required of non-Muslims under Islamic rule. The Samanid dynasty, which emerged as the dominant Persian Muslim power in the region in the 9th century, was officially Islamic but culturally Persian, in a way that provided a relatively welcoming environment for the surviving elements of pre-Islamic Central Asian culture. The patronage of Persian literature by the Samanid court allowed the epic traditions of the Iranian world, including some of the same stories that had been painted on the walls of Panjaket centuries earlier, to be preserved and transmitted in the new literary language of the region. When Ferdowsi wrote the Shahnameh in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, incorporating the Rustam stories that had been depicted in Sogdian murals 300 years before, he was participating in a chain of cultural transmission that the Sogdians had maintained and passed on. The legacy of the Sogdians is scattered across history in ways that are often invisible to people who don't know to look for it, and finding it requires the kind of detective work that historians of the Silk Road have been doing with increasing sophistication over the past century. The most obvious legacy is the writing system chain we have already discussed. Sogdian script, becoming Old Uyghur, becoming traditional Mongolian, becoming Manchu, with the vertical writing direction that resulted from a 90-degree rotation somewhere in that chain, producing one of the most visually distinctive features of Mongolian and Manchu writing. Every document written in traditional Mongolian script, every Manchu imperial decree from the Qing dynasty, every piece of calligraphy in the vertical script that Mongolians in Inner Mongolia still use today, carries within it the distant genetic influence of the Sogdian merchants who used a cursive form of their script to write business letters in the 4th century CE. The paper trail is equally remarkable, in a quite literal sense. The mulberry fiber paper that the Sogdians produced in Samarkand, using techniques they had learned from Chinese contacts and then refined into their own distinctive product, became one of the most important manufactured goods of the medieval Islamic world after the Arab conquest. Paper production in Samarkand continued under Arab and then Persian rule, and Samarkand paper was distributed throughout the Islamic world, reaching Baghdad, Damascus, Cairo, and eventually Moorish Spain and Sicily. From there, the knowledge of papermaking spread into Christian Europe. The paper you are writing on today, or the paper that underlies the digital word processing you are more likely using, is connected through a long chain of transmission to the Sogdian papermakers of the Zarafshan Valley. The Sogdians' role in transmitting Buddhism from India to China and the rest of East Asia is another legacy with enormous long-term consequences. The translation of Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Chinese was one of the great intellectual projects of the early medieval period, and Sogdian monks and scholars were among its key contributors. The specific versions of Buddhist teaching that reached China through the Silk Road were shaped by the communities that transmitted them, and the Sogdian communities of Central Asia and China were among the most active of those transmitters. The animal fables of the Panchatantra, which the Sogdians helped move westward from India, eventually made their way into La Fontaine's fables in 17th century France, and from there into the mainstream of European literary tradition. The fable of the ant and the grasshopper, the fox and the crow, the wolf and the lamb. These stories that most Western children grow up hearing have a genealogy that traces back through Arab and Persian and Sogdian adaptations to the original Sanskrit collection of Vishnu Sharma, and the Sogdians were one of the links in that chain. The Sogdian world dance, or some version of it, may have had a long afterlife in ways that are difficult to trace but fascinating to consider. The spinning dance tradition that Sogdian performers introduced to Tang China found its way into Buddhist ceremonial contexts, into the vocabulary of Chinese dance, and possibly into the Sufi whirling tradition of the Islamic world, though this last connection is speculative and historians debate it. What is certain is that the image of a dancer spinning at high speed on a small carpet, one foot is the fixed point around which the whole body rotates, appears in enough different cultural contexts across Eurasia to suggest that it traveled along the Silk Road networks that the Sogdians maintained. The genetic legacy of the Sogdians is something that modern DNA analysis has recently begun to illuminate. Studies published in 2025 on ancient DNA from Tang Dynasty tombs in northwestern China found individuals with genetic profiles consistent with Sogdian ancestry buried alongside individuals with typical local Chinese genetic profiles, reflecting exactly the pattern of integration and intermarriage that the historical records suggest. The descendants of the Sogdian merchants who built communities in Chang'an and Dunhuang and Turfan are still there, their Sogdian genetic heritage absorbed into the general population of northwestern China over the 14 centuries since the Tang Dynasty, too diluted now to be visible as a distinct community, but not entirely erased. The specific transmission of the Panchatantra fables from India through the Sogdian world to the Islamic and European literary traditions is one of the most clearly documented examples of Silk Road cultural transmission, and it is worth tracing in some detail because it shows how the Sogdians functioned as cultural intermediaries in practice. The Panchatantra was composed in Sanskrit, the classical literary language of India, probably in the 3rd or 4th century CE, though the traditions it draws on are older. It was a collection of animal fables organized around the theme of wise conduct, how to be a good ruler, how to handle friends and enemies, how to navigate the complexities of political life. The stories are clever and morally sophisticated, organized in a framework in which each main story contains embedded sub-stories, which contain their own embedded sub-stories, in a nested structure that could accommodate an almost unlimited range of material. The translation of the Panchatantra into Pahlavi, the Middle Persian language of the Sassanid Empire, took place sometime in the 6th century CE, apparently at the commission of the Persian king Khusrau I, who was known for his intellectual interests and his patronage of translated literature. This translation made the fables available to Persian readers and, through the commercial networks of the period, to the Sogdian-speaking world that was so deeply connected to Persia. Sogdian language fragments of Panchatantra stories have been found in the manuscript collections from Dunhuang and Turfan, confirming that Sogdian translations or adaptations existed. And the murals of Panjakant show visual scenes that scholars have identified as derived from Panchatantra stories, which means that by the 7th century CE, these Indian fables had been so thoroughly absorbed into Sogdian culture that they were being painted on the walls of merchant houses as natural parts of the visual storytelling tradition. From the Sogdian and Persian versions, the fables were translated into Arabic in the 8th century CE, producing a collection called Kalila and Dimna that became one of the most widely read and translated books in the medieval Islamic world. From Arabic, it was translated into many European languages, including Greek, Hebrew, Latin, and various vernaculars. The fable of the lion and the mouse. The story of the tortoise and the hares. The tale of the crow and the fox. These stories, which many Western children grow up hearing in the versions attributed to Aesop or La Fontaine, have genealogies that trace back through Arab and Persian and Sogdian adaptations to the original Sanskrit composition of Vishnu Sharma, and the Sogdians were one of the key links in that chain of transmission. The glass tradition that the Sogdians helped transmit from the Byzantine and Syrian world to China is another legacy with lasting consequences. Chinese craftspeople had long been producing ceramics of extraordinary quality, but glassmaking was not a highly developed Chinese art before the Silk Road period. The blown glass vessels that Sogdian merchants brought from the Byzantine world were considered luxury goods of the highest order in China. They appear in imperial tombs, in temple treasuries, in the most prestigious gift exchanges between rulers. The demand this created eventually stimulated the development of glass production within China itself, and the Chinese glassmaking tradition that developed during the Tang and subsequent periods owes its impetus partly to the market that Sogdian merchants created. The specific techniques of silk weaving that the Sogdians developed were, according to some accounts in Chinese and Byzantine sources, actually superior to Chinese silk in certain respects, particularly in the complexity of the patterns that could be woven into the fabric. This is a remarkable claim, given that silk was a Chinese invention and China had thousands of years of silk working tradition. But the Sogdians had the benefit of being able to observe the textile traditions of both China and the Byzantine Persian world, and their weavers apparently synthesized elements from both traditions into something distinctive. Sogdian silk textiles have been found in Byzantine church treasuries, in Chinese imperial tombs, and in numerous points along the Silk Road and the patterns on them. Complex roundels with animal and hunting scenes, often in brilliant color, were influential on Islamic textile art for centuries after the Sogdians, as a distinct people had ceased to exist. The music that the Sogdians brought to China, the instruments, as much as the specific performance traditions, had lasting effects on Chinese musical culture. The pipa, a four-stringed lute that is one of the central instruments of Chinese traditional music today, was introduced to China through the Silk Road, and Sogdian and other Central Asian musicians were among its primary transmitters. The biwa of Japan, which descended from the same instrument, represents another extension of this musical legacy. The instrument that today fills Japanese concert halls with its distinctive sound has genealogical roots in the musical traditions of Sogdian merchants who brought it to China in the Tang Dynasty period. When you listen to traditional Chinese music, or to Japanese biwa music, or when you encounter a story that traces back to the Panchatantra fables, or when you read Mongolian traditional script with its vertical writing direction, or when you encounter the Manchu language in a museum exhibit about the Qing Dynasty, in all of these moments, you are encountering the legacy of people who lived in the Zarafshan Valley and the Fergana Valley and the other fertile valleys of Central Asia, who ran the trade routes of the ancient world with extraordinary skill and energy, and who left their mark on virtually every culture they touched. They were called the cultural bees, and the name fits. They moved from flower to flower across the entire garden of Eurasian civilization, carrying pollen from one place to another, making possible the cross-pollination that produced the rich variety of medieval culture. Without them, the flowers would have been beautiful but isolated. With them, the garden was connected, and the connections produced something greater than any of the individual parts. The Sogdian name is not well known today, but the world they helped build is the world we live in. The rediscovery of the Sogdians by modern scholarship is itself a story worth telling, because it illustrates something important about how history works and how the past gets recovered. For much of the 19th and early 20th centuries, Central Asian history was treated by Western scholars primarily as a backdrop for the histories of the great empires that had swept through the region: Persian, Greek, Chinese, Mongol, Russian. The local people and their cultures were often treated as passive receivers of influence from these great powers, rather than as active participants in and shapers of the historical process. The Sogdians, who left no empire of their own and no dynasty whose dates could anchor a historical narrative, were particularly neglected. The turning point came with a series of remarkable archaeological discoveries in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. R.L. Stein's expeditions to the desert regions of Central Asia, conducted between 1900 and 1916, recovered thousands of manuscripts and artifacts from the cave deposits of Dunhuang and from sites along the ancient trade routes of the Taklamakan Desert. Among these finds were the Sogdian ancient letters and substantial collections of Sogdian language, religious, and commercial texts. The task of deciphering and analyzing these materials occupied scholars for decades. Simultaneously, Soviet archaeologists working in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan from the 1930s onward began systematic excavations of Sogdian city sites. The work at Panjikent, beginning in 1946, revealed the extraordinary mural paintings we have discussed. Excavations at the Eurasia Mound in Samarkand uncovered more Sogdian period paintings, including the famous embassy painting that shows envoys from various foreign powers arriving at the Sogdian court, each group dressed in its own distinctive cultural style: Chinese, Indian, Korean, Turkish. A vivid illustration of the cosmopolitan connections that Samarkand maintained in its heyday. The palace at Varaksha, near Bukhara, yielded more painted rooms, including one depicting the king of Bukhara on an elephant, hunting fantastic creatures. A room that mixes Iranian, Indian, and local Central Asian artistic traditions in the characteristic Sogdian way, combining every influence available into something entirely its own. The scholarship that grew from these discoveries has transformed the understanding of Silk Road history. Earlier accounts had tended to see the Silk Road as primarily a connection between China and the Mediterranean world, with Central Asia as the route between them rather than as a place with its own distinctive history. The Sogdian evidence changed this. Central Asia, and specifically Sogdiana, was not just a corridor. It was a creative center, a place where the world's great civilizations met and produced something new. Something that was neither Chinese nor Persian nor Indian, but had absorbed and transformed elements of all of them. The Smithsonian Institution in Washington created a major exhibition on the Sogdians in 2011, titled The Silk Road, Trade, Travel, War, and Faith, which brought their story to a broad public audience for the first time. The British Museum has written about them extensively. The major academic publishers have produced multi-volume scholarly works on Sogdian language, art, and history. The International Dunhuang Project has digitized thousands of Sogdian language manuscripts and made them available online. And yet, for all this scholarly attention, the Sogdians remain largely unknown to the general public. Ask 100 educated people who the Sogdians were, and you will be lucky to find 5 who know. This is partly because they left no empire, and no dynasty, and no single dramatic story that can be easily narrated. Their greatness was distributed, cumulative, commercial, and linguistic rather than military or architectural. In a culture that celebrates conquerors and builders, the people who ran the connective tissue of civilization are easily overlooked. The recent DNA studies, published in 2025, are the newest chapter in the Sogdian rediscovery story. Genetic analysis of Tang Dynasty-era human remains in northwestern China has confirmed the genetic presence of Central Asian ancestry, consistent with Sogdian origin, in the population of that region during the period when historical records document Sogdian merchant communities there. Science is now confirming in DNA what archaeology and linguistics had already established in manuscripts and artifacts. The Sogdians were real, they were there, they mattered, and their traces are still findable if you know where to look. The International Dunhuang Project, based at the British Library in London, represents one of the most significant modern efforts to recover and preserve Sogdian heritage. The cave deposits at Dunhuang, sealed up around 1000 CE and rediscovered in 1900, contained approximately 50,000 manuscripts and other objects in languages including Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, Uyghur, and Sogdian. These documents were scattered among the British Museum, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, the National Museum of China, and other institutions in the early 20th century when various expeditions, including Stein's, acquired portions of the collection. The International Dunhuang Project has been digitizing all of these scattered documents and making them available online, allowing scholars anywhere in the world to access them. For Sogdian studies, this has been enormously valuable. Texts that were physically spread across 5 continents can now be studied together, compared, cross-referenced in ways that were impossible when the physical documents were in different countries. The Sogdian manuscripts from Dunhuang include Buddhist texts, Manichaean texts, commercial documents, and personal letters, representing the full range of Sogdian literary production. Some of the texts are unique survivals, the only existing copies of works that were otherwise completely lost. Others are duplicates of texts that exist in other collections, allowing scholars to track the transmission of specific texts across the Silk Road network. Together, they are a library in miniature, preserved in a sealed cave for 1,000 years and now being read for the first time in over a millennium. The work of Sogdian scholars today is also being enriched by advances in genetics and physical anthropology. The 2025 DNA studies of Tang Dynasty burials in northwestern China are only the most recent example of how scientific methods are being applied to questions about the Sogdians that textual and archaeological evidence alone cannot fully answer. Who were the Sogdians genetically? How deeply did they mix with the populations of the regions they traded in? How quickly did they assimilate? These questions, which could only be answered vaguely from historical documents, are now being addressed with the tools of modern genomics, producing results that generally confirm the historical picture while adding new detail and occasionally new surprises. The picture that emerges from all of this work is of a people who were physically diverse even before they began spreading out across Eurasia. The genetic studies suggest that the Sogdians already showed evidence of admixture between Central and East Asian genetic populations before the historical period, reflecting the long history of contact and movement in Central Asia, and who became more diverse, still as they established communities from China to the Mediterranean. There was no single Sogdian look, just as there was no single Sogdian religion or single Sogdian political structure. What united them was the language, the commercial traditions, the family networks, and the shared cultural identity of people who knew they were Sogdian and found that identity worth maintaining as long as the world allowed them to. What does it mean for a civilization to be forgotten? The Sogdians controlled the trade of the world for 4 centuries. Their language was spoken from China to the Mediterranean. Their script gave birth to the writing systems of 3 major world cultures. Their merchants carried the stories and religions and artistic traditions that shaped the civilizations on both ends of the routes they traveled. And then they disappeared into the larger cultures that surrounded them, and the world moved on without noting their absence. And for 1,000 years, their name was known only to a few specialists who happened to be reading 4th century business letters found in desert watchtowers. There is something quietly extraordinary about this. The Sogdians did not disappear because they were conquered or killed off. They disappeared because they were successful, because their commercial networks connected them so thoroughly to the other cultures of Eurasia that their descendants had the option of simply becoming part of those cultures, adopting new languages and new religious identities while continuing to live and work and raise their children in the same valleys and cities their ancestors had inhabited. The Sogdian merchant who converted to Islam in the 8th century and began speaking Persian was not erasing his ancestry. He was adapting it, in the Sogdian way, to the conditions of the world as he found it. The values and practices that made the Sogdians successful never entirely disappeared, even when the Sogdian identity did. The trading cities of Uzbekistan and Tajikistan continued to function as commercial centers after the Sogdian period ended. Samarkand under the Timurid dynasty in the 14th and 15th centuries was magnificent. The building programs of Timur produced the Registan and the other architectural wonders that still stand there today. And that magnificence was built on a commercial and agricultural foundation that the Sogdians had laid 1,000 years earlier. The irrigation systems that made the Zarafshan Valley productive were Sogdian in origin. The commercial networks that sustained the bazaars were descended from Sogdian commercial traditions. The linguistic tradition that the Sogdians helped establish, the translation of texts from one language to another, the careful maintenance of meaning across cultural boundaries, was continued by the Persian language scholars of the Islamic period who did for Greek philosophy and Indian mathematics what the Sogdians had done for Buddhist scripture and Indian fables, translated it, adapted it, carried it to new audiences. The process by which ancient knowledge survived the disruptions of history and became available to the cultures that would build the next phase of civilization. That process depended on translators and carriers and intermediaries, people whose gift was for crossing boundaries rather than building walls, and the Sogdians had been those people for 400 years before their successors took up the role. There is a modern lesson in the Sogdian story, or at least a modern resonance with it. We live in an age that is in some ways more connected than any age since the peak of the Silk Road, where goods and ideas and people move across the world at speeds the Sogdians could not have imagined, and where the commercial and cultural infrastructure that makes this possible is maintained by people who are often as invisible and as underappreciated as the Sogdian merchants themselves. The people who run the supply chains, who know the languages, who understand the customs of multiple cultures simultaneously, who make the connections that allow the world to work. These are the Sogdians of our time. They do not build monuments to themselves. They just keep the world moving. What the wall paintings of Panjakant tell us, more than anything else, is that the Sogdians knew who they were. They painted their walls with the stories that mattered to them. Iranian heroes and Indian fables and scenes of feasting and music and the world arriving at their doors in all its variety. And they made those walls beautiful, because beauty was worth making even if nobody outside the Zarafshan Valley was ever likely to see it. The paintings were for themselves, for their families, for the next generation who would grow up in rooms decorated with all the stories the world had to offer. That generation grew up, and their children grew up, and their children's children, and the world changed around them in ways nobody fully predicted. And eventually the language changed, and the religion changed, and the name changed. But the valley remained, and the river remained, and the mountains remained. And in the Zarafshan Valley today, there are still people who drink tea in the morning and do business in the market and tell stories in the evening, in the place where their ancestors once ran the world. The Sogdians are forgotten, mostly. But the things they carried are still here. In the scripts that people write with, in the stories that people tell, in the traditions of hospitality and trade, and the crossing of boundaries that still characterize the cultures of Central Asia. In the wall paintings that stare out from museum cases in St. Petersburg and Dushanbe with the bright eyes of people who knew things that the world has been slowly rediscovering ever since. Mune wrote to her husband from a desert city in the 4th century without knowing that her letter would survive her by 1,600 years. She called him a pig's husband, which was the most cutting insult available to her in her language, and then she folded the paper and sealed it and waited, and the letter was lost in a watchtower in the desert, and it lay there, and it lay there, and eventually an archaeologist with a shovel and a curiosity about old things found it, and unfolded it, and read it. And a woman who had been forgotten for 16 centuries was angry again. That is what history does with the things people leave behind. It waits, and then it finds them, and then it listens. There is something worth sitting with, in the quiet of whatever night this is for you, about what it means for a civilization to be great without leaving monuments. The pyramids of Egypt have never been forgotten, because you cannot forget a pyramid. The Colosseum of Rome has never been forgotten, because you cannot forget a stadium that holds 50,000 people. The Great Wall of China has never been forgotten, because you cannot forget a wall you can see from the air. These are civilizations that made things too large to ignore. The Sogdians made things that were smaller and more fragile. Letters on paper, business records on clay tablets, wall paintings in houses that the desert eventually buried, inscriptions on rocks in mountain passes where very few people walked. They made trust and language and commercial relationships and the infrastructure of exchange, none of which photographs well and none of which impresses people who are looking for something dramatic. And yet the Sogdians moved the world in ways that the pyramid builders and the wall builders did not. They moved it by connecting things that had been separate, by carrying goods and ideas and stories from one end of the known world to the other for 4 centuries, by making it possible for a Chinese emperor to wear Byzantine glass on his table, and for a Roman aristocrat's daughter to wear silk on her back, and for a medieval French philosopher to read Indian fables in a Latin translation that had traveled through Arabic and Persian and Sogdian and Sanskrit before arriving in his library. The Sogdians were practical people. They were not dreamers or idealists in the way we sometimes romanticize historical heroes. They were merchants who got up early and went to bed late and counted their silver carefully and wrote down every transaction because their lives depended on getting the accounting right. They learned languages because languages were tools that allowed them to make money. They were curious about other cultures' religions, partly because genuine curiosity was their nature, and partly because a merchant who respected other people's gods got better deals in the markets those people controlled. But the practical people who connect the world are doing something sacred, in a way, even if they are not thinking about it in those terms. Every bolt of silk that passed through Sogdian hands from a Chinese loom to a Roman bedroom was a connection between people who would never meet, who did not share a language or a god or a set of customs, who knew nothing about each other except what the merchant who moved between them chose to tell. The Sogdians chose to tell a great deal. They were, by all accounts, good storytellers. They understood that a story shared was a connection made, and that connections were the foundation of commercial relationships, and that commercial relationships were the foundation of everything else. Mune, who called her absent husband a pig and a dog from the end of the Silk Road in the year 313, was not a great figure in the historical sense. She was a stranded woman in a foreign city, dependent on charity, unable to get home, writing letters that never arrived. But she wrote with a voice that carries across 1,600 years with perfect clarity, and in that voice you can hear everything about what the Sogdians were. Intelligent, direct, emotionally honest, deeply connected to the world through networks of obligation and love and commercial necessity, and absolutely not willing to pretend that things were fine when they were not. I would rather be a dog's wife or a pig's wife than yours. That sentence has survived longer than most empires. It has survived longer than the dynasty that was collapsing around her when she wrote it. It has survived longer than the watchtower where her letter lay waiting for 1,600 years. It is still here, and she is still here in it, this woman whose name means tiger cub, who followed her husband to the end of the world and was left there, and who said exactly what she thought about it in the clearest possible language. The Sogdians built their civilization out of exactly that kind of clarity. They looked at the world without illusion, counted what they had, understood what they needed, and then went out and got it with a combination of commercial intelligence and physical courage and personal warmth that allowed them to be welcome everywhere they went for 4 centuries. When they were gone, the world had lost something real. Not a monument, not an empire, not a dynasty, but a specific kind of human excellence that is always rare and always worth noticing when it appears. The excellence of the people who connect things, who make the world larger by moving through it, who carry the world's stories and goods and ideas across the distances that would otherwise keep them apart. Tonight, wherever you are, whatever distance separates you from the people and places that matter to you, there is a little bit of that excellence still in the world. It is in every translator who makes understanding possible across a language barrier. It is in every traveler who brings back something real from a place they visited. It is in every story told across a campfire or a kitchen table or a podcast or a YouTube channel, moving from one mind to another across whatever distance lies between them. The Sogdians would have found it entirely natural, I think, to speak to you this way. From one side of the world to the other, through the medium of words, across a gulf of time as wide as the Pamir Mountains. They were in the business of crossing impossible distances. There is one more thing worth saying about the Sogdians, and it is this. The forgetting of a civilization is never entirely complete. Even when the name is lost and the language is silent and the temples are buried, the things that civilization produced continue to move through the world, carrying traces of their origin in ways that can be recovered if you know what to look for. The Mongolian script, which carries within it the rotated Sogdian letter forms, is still read and written today in Inner Mongolia. The Panchatantra fables, which the Sogdians helped carry west, are still told to children in dozens of countries in dozens of different versions. The pipa is still played in Chinese music conservatories and concert halls. The merchant families of Central Asia, whose ancestors may have been Sogdian before they became Persian or Uzbek or Tajik, are still conducting trade in the cities of the Zarafshan Valley. The academic study of the Sogdians is, in the current period, more active and more productive than it has ever been. New manuscript discoveries, new DNA studies, new archaeological excavations, new computational tools for analyzing ancient texts. All of these are producing a clearer picture of the Sogdian world with each passing year. The people who were forgotten for nearly a millennium are being remembered with increasing precision and increasing appreciation. If there is a lesson in the Sogdian story, and perhaps the best lessons are the ones you draw for yourself rather than the ones that are stated, it might be this. The people who hold the world together are often the people who get the least credit for it, because their work is invisible in the way that any infrastructure is invisible when it is working. You do not notice the road until the road is gone. You do not notice the translation until the translator stops translating. You do not notice the merchant network until the goods stop flowing. The Sogdians held the world together for 4 centuries. When they were gone, the world noticed in the way that worlds notice the loss of essential infrastructure. Slowly at first, then more urgently, then with a kind of resigned adaptation to a world that worked less well than it had. The works they left behind, the letters, the paintings, the translations, the scripts, the stories, are the fingerprints of people who mattered and who deserve to be remembered. Remember them tonight, from wherever you are, at whatever hour this is for you. They carried the world's stories so that the world could know itself. Now the story finds its way back to them. Sweet dreams.